Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Sharp. I am Director of Communications and Strategy at Scottish Renewables. I've been at SR for 7 years, which makes me one of the oldest hands there. So I would hope that I know a number of people on this webinar. To those of you who aren't members of SR, welcome. It's great to have you along. We're really pleased to be able to reach out to the wider business community and bring Nigel to you today as a keynote speaker in this webinar. We're absolutely we're committed to ensuring that renewable energy and indeed Scottish Renewables are at the heart of the COP26 conference in Glasgow next year. So this event is part of a series that we'll be holding in the next 18 months as we run up to that conference. We were prepared to do that in November. Obviously, events have intervened and we'll now be welcoming international delegates to Glasgow in November 2021. I thought I'd just give you a short introduction to Scottish Renewables. For those of you who might not know who we are the industry body for renewable energy in Scotland. We have around 260 members. We represent all renewable energy technologies from wind and solar through renewable heat, all the way across to innovative technologies like floating wind and wave and tidal energy. We also cover grid infrastructure and charging and planning and all those things which help our industry succeed. So in short, it's our job as an organisation to grow Scotland's renewable energy sector and sustain its position at the forefront of the global clean energy industry. If you'd like any more detail on what we do, how we can help your business, do get in touch after the event. My details are on our website. Anyway, enough about us. The Climate Ambition Alliance was formed at the Climate Action Summit in 2019. Its role was to push countries to be more ambitious in their efforts to tackle climate change and also to increase the involvement of the private sector in that goal. That's you guys. Before I go on to set out Nigel Topping's place in that effort, I want to run some numbers past you. The Climate Ambition Alliance is already made up of 120 countries, but it's that private sector involvement which really startled me. Also involved alongside national governments are 449 cities, 21 regions, 995 businesses, 38 of the world's biggest investors and 505 universities. Together, the Climate Ambition Alliance now covers nearly 25% of global CO2 emissions and over half of the world's GDP. So today we're joined, as you know, from the title of the event, by Nigel Topping, who is the UK's high-level climate action champion for COP26. I'm going to try a Zoom trick here and I'm going to spotlight Nigel so that we can see him. Hopefully that works. Good morning, Nigel.
Good morning. I works for everyone except for me because I have to stare at myself. But thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you.
Hope that's not too unnerving. So alongside the Chilean high-level climate action champion, Nigel leads Race to Zero, which was set up to build momentum around the shift to a decarbonised economy ahead of COP26. Nigel was previously CEO of We Mean Business, where he drove radical collaboration for climate action among NGOs working with the world's most influential businesses. Before I hand over to Nigel, I need to run through some housekeeping. In order for the event to flow smoothly, you'll have noticed that your microphones have been muted. We will, however, have plenty of time for a Q&A towards the end of the hour. So thanks, first of all, to those of you who have submitted questions already. If you haven't, you can enter any questions you'd like to ask in the Zoom chat, which has been moderated by my colleague, Cara. Please do remember that those questions are visible to everyone. Slightly unusual departure here. Nigel will be speaking without slides, which is great, but he's asked if you are comfortable doing so, and I see Kirsty MacArthur already has. Please turn your cameras on. It's far easier to speak to a screen of people than it is to speak to a screen of little black rectangles. So if you are comfortable doing so, please switch your camera on. As I said, I've spotlighted Nigel. When we come to the Q&A, I will turn that feature off. If you're not au fait with Zoom, what that does is return you to speaker view, so you will see whoever is speaking. If you want to go back to gallery view and see all those lovely faces, there are 9 little dots in the top right hand corner of your screen, which will take you to gallery view. If you click that, that will bring everybody back. The webinar is being recorded, just for your information, and finally we'll be tweeting from this event, so please do join in on social media. We are at ScotRenew, Nigel is at TopNigel, and you can tag hashtag COP26 and hashtag Race to Zero as well. I think that's me, so yeah, Nigel, over to you.
Great, thanks, Nick, and it's lovely to see those of you who are prepared to show that you're not working on emails whilst listening to me, I understand we're all multitasking these days. Great to see you. My first thing I want to say is thank you to Nick, and thank you to Scottish Renewables for the chance to speak to you, and really thank you to Scotland for everything that you're doing to lead the energy transition at all levels. You can't tell from my accent, but I'm a proud Scot myself. I was born in Bishopbriggs in Glasgow, and spent some of my early years in Thurso and then near the Black Isle before coming down as a young boy and losing my accent. So I'm really looking forward to the COP in Glasgow, and I'm hoping to visit Scotland for a few days, COVID travel permitting in October. Nick's done a great job of introducing me. I thought I'd just explain my role a little bit first, and then I want to talk a bit more about Race to Zero, because it's a slightly unusual construct, the role. So unless you follow the details of the UN climate negotiations, you may not have heard of the role of high-level climate action champion, which is my honour to hold now. As Nick said, the role was created in Paris. So the most important thing that was created in Paris was the Paris Agreement in 2015, when the world's countries came together to agree the framework and the process for getting to net zero. And one of the things which helped land the Paris Agreement was the mobilization of the voice of the private sector, so businesses and investors and local governments, or in the sensitive language of the UK devolution system, governments who don't have a seat at the UN convention. So that would include the government of Scotland, the government of California, for example, who don't have a legal seat at the table in the UN convention, but of course have hugely important political and economic and policy making roles, just as the private sector have hugely important roles in terms of implementation and in terms of also making policymakers comfortable that this transition is possible. So alongside the Paris Agreement, which is the main deal, this role was created, and the idea is that whichever country takes on the presidency of the UN climate process, which is handed over every year, and as you know, for COP26, the UK are taking over the presidency. Actually, Alok Sharma, our business secretary, becomes president on day one of the COP. So at the moment, to be accurate, he's the president designate. Chile still holds the presidency of the process, and important in terms of some of the preparatory work. So of course, those two presidencies have to work closely together. And similarly, I work very closely with Gonzalo Munoz, the Chilean high-level champion, who, like me, also has a background in the private sectors. This is the first time that we have two champions who have a background in the private sector. And then after COP26, Gonzalo will step down after 2 cycles, and I will continue for 1 more cycle, working alongside an incoming African presidency, an African champion. And the role, very simply, is just to drive ambition and action. It's quite loosely defined. It's a strong mandate, but it's loosely defined. So I work for that mandate closely with the UK team, but I'm not a member of the UK government, or I don't represent the UK government. Of course, I work very closely with the UK COP26 team. And with Gonzalo, we've laid out basically three broad objectives. The first, and the one I'm going to talk about mostly, is the Race to Zero. It's about massively increasing the signal from our stakeholder community, what the UN system calls non-state actors or non-party stakeholders. And we're aiming to have 10 times as many entities, businesses, investors, cities, etc., to be on that journey, be in the Race to Zero by the time we get to Glasgow. We think that's really important in terms of the signal that it sends of commitment and willingness and possibility and momentum, that this is not just a fringe issue that people believe it, but it's already happening. And that governments take the voice of the private sector very, very seriously, and gives them a lot of confidence when they see lots of private sector actors committing to this journey with them. We call it the ambition loop. You know, the more business and cities step up, the easier it makes it for national governments to step up, and then the more national governments raise the floor, as it were, it makes it easier for the leaders to raise the bar again, and we try and drive around that ambition loop as much as we can. So that's our first objective, and I'm going to talk more about that in detail later. The second objective is at a much more granular level to work on sectoral transformations. So, because you're all very familiar with the energy sector transformation, although there's some exciting, relatively new areas of that, like the hydrogen economy, which we really hope to highlight and help project and speed up in this year. but there are many other sectors where the progress is nothing like as good as it has been, and which are related. So heavy energy use and heavy emitting sectors like steel, plastics, cement, who are really challenged, as they often have process emissions, so need, like in the energy sector, they need their own complete process transformation and also circularization to reduce primary steel production, for example. And we're doing that by organizing the community, which is called the Marrakesh Partnership, because it was launched in the COP after Paris, in Morocco, Marrakesh, and that's broadly a community of mainly NGOs who are working with businesses, cities. It's sort of the network of networks, if you like. And so with those partners, we're working on 1.5 degree pathways, which are just documents which just describe what do businesses, investors, local governments, etc. need to do in 2021, 2025, 2030 to be on track for getting to zero as fast as possible in each sector. Those were pioneered last year by Gonzalo with the Marrakesh Partnership, and we're updating them at the moment. And we hope to put at the heart of those the S curves of new technology uptake and the cost curves of new technology cost down. Again, I'll say a few words about that later. And our third objective is to use all of that momentum to support governments around the world in raising their ambition, working closely with the UK, considerable diplomatic outreach. And a lot of that is about making sure that governments understand just how much is happening in the private sector, and how much momentum there is within local government, which quite often is going faster than national governments, who often are perhaps more influenced by incumbent industries, which we need to wind down, than by the growing industries, which we need to wind up. So we're trying to help address that by making sure that there's really good information about just how fast this transition is happening, how good it is for economies, and how good it is for job creation. Particularly relevant as we come out of COVID-19 and seek to make recovery packages ones which support a faster, resilient, job-rich recovery. So the race to zero. Nick stole my thunder with some of the big numbers, but the idea, as I say, is it's really very simple. It's that the more of you publicly commit to getting to net zero as soon as possible, then the more that builds the sort of snowball effect. It's much easier for a company to make that commitment when they look around and see 3 of their 5 biggest competitors have already done it. It reduces the risk. Similarly, it's much bigger for a city to make that kind of commitment when they see that their main suppliers are doing that. Similarly, it's much easier for a government to make those kind of commitments when they hear a loud voice from those stakeholders that they want it, that they're committed to it, that they're already doing it, and they could go faster with national government support. So the idea is really quite simple. It's built off, as Nick says, this Climate Ambition Alliance, which was launched only in September last year with the Chilean presidency and the Secretary General trying to get as many countries as possible. Although it's true that we already have 23% of emissions covered, as Nick says, surprisingly, that already includes 120 countries out of the roughly 200 who are parties to the UN Climate Convention. Of course, the reason that 60% of the countries only, plus all of the non-state actors, only get us to a quarter of emissions is that it doesn't include the States, China, India, none of which have made net zero commitments. And very unlikely that all 3 of them will have done by the time we get to Glasgow, which is why it's so important that all of this non-state actor, this private sector and local government work continues to build momentum. It's also worth noting that this sort of, if you like, the new North Star of net zero as soon as possible and by 2050 at the latest, or as Gonzalo and I like to say, building the zero carbon economy for the 2040s, is relatively new for all of us not all of us, some people have been championing that for a while, the small island states who were literally pleading for 1.5 to stay alive because their countries are drowning in Paris. They're the stakeholders who really fought for and got 1.5 as a sort of second tier goal in Paris. But of course, the IPCC report in October 2018 really changed the game for everybody, and that's the one that really pointed out the massive difference in economic and human damage between every 0.1 of a degree and every year between 2 and 1.5. So really the business momentum for net zero really only started in in June last year when we launched, I was at Women Business then, and when we launched the net zero campaign for business, and we were nervous because we thought maybe we're moving the goalpost too soon after Paris. We have leading companies who've been committing to 2 degrees before Paris, then well below 2 degrees after Paris, as that was the new benchmark. And could we suddenly move the? So we set ourselves an initial objective to get 100 businesses to commit to net zero by Glasgow by this November. As Nick said, we're already at actually now over 1,000, because the numbers that Nick quoted are the ones that we use for the launch and that are in the presentation we've shared. But every week more businesses are joining, so it's really remarkable. Basically, in a year, we've gone from a handful to over 1,000 companies, from a handful to 500 cities, and the momentum with investors and regions is only growing. And Nick didn't mention, we now have 500 universities. There's now a really strong network in the UK. Of course, committing to net zero in the UK by 2050 is not really a leadership position. It's a compliance position. If you're in Scotland, 2045 is a compliance position. So leaders should be looking at earlier dates. But even if you're just matching the government data, it helps because it publicly projects that level of ambition. The other figure that's really interesting is that we now have 2.6 billion people. So we have half of the world's economy, a quarter of the world's emissions, and a third of the world's people already living in a place which is covered by a net zero 2050 or earlier commitment. And we've got 16 months to go. So our objective is to get up to 70% of the world economy or more covered. Obviously we'll have a big boost if a climate progressive candidate wins the US election. Although we shouldn't forget that because of the degree of non-state actor commitment, a lot of the US economy is already covered by very bold net zero goals. California, 5th biggest economy in the world, has a net zero 2045 goal, and continues to innovate with some recent news around net zero trucking, for example. So that, again, another example of why it's really important not just to look at the state level. Australia is another good example where the federal government is not ambitious on climate, but every single state and territory in Australia has a net zero goal. So the entire population of Australia, the entire economy, is covered by a net zero goal of one form, if not at the national level. It's pretty easy for businesses to join, so you should all join. I've set Nick the target of every member of Scottish Renewables to be publicly in the race to zero by the time we get to Glasgow. I can see no reason why you wouldn't do that. It's in your own interests because it's growing your own market. And we've shared some information in the slide deck. There's really a couple of ways of joining. There's the committing to a net zero science-based target, and joining a business ambition for 1.5 campaign, which is hosted on the you can find that on the Women Business website or the Science Based Targets website or the UN Global Compact website. And the International Chambers of Commerce have recently launched an initiative which is seeking to make it a bit simpler for SMEs, and I'm guessing many of you are SMEs. So the Science Based Targets Initiative and the Chambers Initiative both have pathways for SMEs, but basically you should all do that as fast as possible, and it'd be great to have a little bit of intra-UK rivalry. See if you can get more Scottish companies to commit to joining the race to zero than English, and put a bit of pressure on your colleagues south of the border to try and match your ambition. Just to give you a kind of example of, I mean, this is now covering businesses in all sectors. So of course you've got big electric utilities like Enel, Ørsted, Iberdrola, Vattenfall. You've got a lot of the big retailers, Amazon, net zero 2040. Remember, that covers their whole value chain. It's not just their warehouses and their trucking. But when they made that commitment, they immediately committed to buying 100,000 electric delivery vehicles. That's and going 100% renewable. But interestingly, recently we're also getting more and more heavy industry players joining. So Maersk Shipping, Mercedes, the inventor of the internal combustion engine, net zero 2039. Steel companies on the back of the Mission Possible report I mentioned, and the policy pathway in Europe. You have people like ThyssenKrupp and ArcelorMittal, at least in Europe, committing to net zero. But again, that proves that that kind of breaks the myth that it's not possible. And some of those areas need a lot more investment in R&D, and some of that is leading to the increased interest in hydrogen, particularly for both storage as well as high temperature thermal applications, as well as possible applications via ammonia as a carrier as a shipping fuel, as a zero carbon shipping fuel. And of course, the major consumer goods companies, so Unilever, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, and increasingly with ambition that's earlier than 2050, Unilever net zero 2039, Natura, one of the world's biggest cosmetic companies, net zero 2030. So again, encourage you all to join. I'm sure Nick can help signpost you, or we can help signpost you, but it'd be good to have an objective. Did you say you've got 160 members, Nick? Did I get that right? Yeah, so that, you know, maybe you should aim to have 200 members and all of them to be in the race to zero by the time we get to Glasgow. The last point I want to make, just before maybe open up to any questions, is that it's not just about the long-term goal, it's really about the actions in the next 5 to 10 years. As all of you know, we need to more than halve emissions in the next 10 years. So there's no point having a fancy 2050 or 2040 goal without a plan for the next 5 to 10 years. So part of the criteria for the race to zero are not just a long-term goal, but short-term action plan, and then transparency about progress on that. And my final point to make is that we're very firm believers, and we're putting this in the heart of our work on sectoral transformation, that well, it's not belief. We know empirically that industrial transformation always happens exponentially. The cumulative effect of volume deployment is cost down in a predictable way with known learning rates, and awareness and interconnectivity drive the exponential deployment. Electric vehicles is my favorite example of that, because when we left Paris, so in early 2016, the IEA was still saying that we'd be building and selling combustion engines in 2070, and then we start having you know, national level phase out dates like UK 2040, Scotland 2032, Netherlands 2030, Norway 2025. We start having huge pressure from cities driven by the particularly concerns over dirty air, which have only been exacerbated by COVID, of course. So we have you know, increasingly the voice of mayors driving that transition. But then we also have the exponential change of adoption. So what I really like to point out is the stupidity of saying we're only at 2 or 3% of a technology like that. The issue is not whether you're at 2 or 3%, but how quickly are we doubling? The German market just hit 8.4% of pure electric and 17% of electric plus hybrid. That's 1 in 6 cars. That's almost trebled in the last year alone. So there's still a lot of really bad thinking about how fast this transition can happen and will happen. And I know you're on the good side of that, because you understand just how fast costs have come down and what the potential is for job creation and for macroeconomic benefits. But even something as esteemed as Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who many look to as a more progressive voice for the transition than the IEA have historically been, they're still saying that we'll only get to 58% electric vehicles by market share by 2040, 20 years away. In the same report that they say that the sticker price parity, which is considered the not cost of ownership parity, because we're already there, but sticker price parity will only be reached, will already be reached by the mid-20s. So it's really baffling to me how so many intelligent analysts and opinion formers can predict a future which defies all economic rationality. So what they're effectively saying is that 58% by 2040, so maybe 2060 before we get to 100%. So 3 or 4 decades after we reach the point where the product is cheaper, cleaner, healthier, easier to maintain, longer lasting, and sexier in this case, which I think can apply to cars, maybe not to renewable energy. So it defies all logic. So I just encourage all of you to keep telling the stories of just how fast your sector's changed and continues to change, with the costs continuing to go down for storage and for not just renewables, but importantly electrolysis, which is what really opens up the combination of continuing plummeting of story of renewables plus electrolysis is what will open up the hydrogen economy. Personally, I'm really hopeful that Scotland can continue to lead, both locally in terms of the story of economic growth, job creation, just transition from hydrocarbons to clean energy, but also internationally in terms of generating a really powerful export base based on that local leadership. I look forward to getting a chance to meet some of you when I do get to Scotland later in the year, and to doing anything I can to help tell the story of your progress and to accelerate it. And with that, Nick, I'll hand back to you and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Nigel. That was great. Thank you. You would normally get a round of applause, but for those of us who are on camera, we can give Nigel a little round of applause for that. Thank you. Really great run through. I'm going to cancel Nigel's spotlight now, so some of you should now be able to see me as well. Remember, if you want to get back to gallery view so you can see both of us at once, in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom window, certainly, are 9 little dots. If you hover, it says gallery view. Press that, as I have just done, and you'll go back to seeing everyone. Okay, so a bit of a reflection on that, I suppose. We are, at Scottish Renewables, we represent, as I said, 260 companies, all working in their own ways towards net zero, and many of them have been for many decades now. As an industry body, it's our role to help you guys shout about what you are doing. That's absolutely my role at Scottish Renewables as communications director. So if anybody's interested in that Race to Zero commitment, and I would hope that many of you are, we'll be circulating the slides again in a follow-up email after this webinar. In the slides you can find a lot of information about how to go a bit further in that pledge, and I know we've had questions asked about that in the chat already. So Nigel, they'll be circulated after the call, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But just for those of you who are on the webinar and are members of Scottish Renewables, please come to us and help us share the stories of what you are doing to accelerate the transition to net zero, because some of you have remarkable stories, and a lot of the time you go on with business as usual and you're so busy doing the next project and doing the next big thing that you forget to stop and tell people what you've done. And there are these remarkable stories in membership that we love to share, and it's actually really imperative on us all that we all do all we can to share them and get those stories in front of the media and in front of politicians and in front of the public, because as Nigel said, they are absolutely inspirational. So happy to help you do that. Again, my details are on the website. I lead a comms team of 3, and we have a policy team 2 who can help you with challenges in your own businesses. But yeah, really from a personal point of view, if you want to shout about what you're doing, please do let us know and we can help you as SR members. Nigel, I suppose I was going to kick off the Q&A by asking you just a little bit about yourself and your previous career, and about what motivates you and why you got into this. It's obviously a challenging and very wide-ranging role, but yeah, looking back, how did you get to where you are now, and what gets you out of bed in the morning?
Well, I don't know, like most little boys, I was very influenced by my father, and actually also my grandfather. My father was a civil engineer, which is why we moved around. So we were in Glasgow because he was supervising what they call continuous slip forming, which is of grain silos on the banks of the Clyde, for Taylor Woodrow, who he worked for then. So he was running sort of 12-hour night shifts operations where you keep jacking up the forms. So you pour concrete in and it goes slow enough so that by the time you jack it up, it's set at the bottom, but you keep moving it up. So you get a smooth form. I checked out the other day. I think they're just being knocked out. The final one's just being knocked down for a fancy riverside development, which is the way of the world. Which is why I ended up being the only Scotland fan in my primary school when Ali's army were going to win the World Cup in 1978, which is a very traumatic experience, which those of you who are old enough to have shared that experience will know how traumatic it was to lose 3-1 to Peru when we were in the first game and we were supposed to be anyway. But my father was a civil engineer, so there's something about building things which I've kind of inherited in terms of, but I've ended up building organizations and collaborations in particular. But my father was also someone who'd spent a lot of time in the Arctic. There's there's a lot of sort of romance in the UK about the Arctic and the Antarctic. So I ended up becoming fascinated and going on several climbing and scientific expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and Patagonia as a young man. And actually, it was in Greenland in 1987 that I actually came across the quite dramatic effects of global warming. I was supposed to be doing some research on the end of a glacier called Surmullet Glacier in East Greenland. And we think no one had ever been there before because there's no real reason to go there apart from doing this. And the Inuit wouldn't go there because there's no hunting there. But there was a map from this was of course before digital mapping, right, in 1987. And when you're a mountaineer, you're used to treating the map as kind of the gospel truth. So we go over this really remarkably desolate terrain, and we get to this, it's supposed to be a glacier 5 kilometers wide. And we get there and there's a fjord 5 kilometers wide and no ice. So we spent about an hour trying to figure out how we'd made such a terrible navigational error because we thought the map was right. And eventually it dawned on us that the map was right and that what had changed wasn't the map, but the world had changed, and that the glacier had receded by about 20 kilometers. We could barely see it in the distance. So, and then I went into industry because I wanted to do something real. After university, and I spent nearly 20 years in manufacturing. And the last role was as part of a team that we bought and bought out and grew a company called TMD Friction. It's the biggest manufacturer of brake pads in the world. So not very romantic, but brake pads generate more power than engines. So they're very incredible, sophisticated bits of composite engineering, even though they just look like random grey dust to the non-expert. So I did that for 20 years, and then I took some time out to pivot, well, to think about what I wanted to do next. And I've always, because I've been an outdoorsman, I've always been interested in the environment, and I was very aware of climate change. And I'm also, I studied math. I'm interested in the way things work systemically. So I became really interested in, I found a lot of people saying the problem is greedy business people, or the problem is business. And most of my fans didn't know any business people or hadn't worked in business. And of course, business is the deliverer of whatever society wants, really, right? I mean, society decides and business delivers. It's not the other way around. Although you could argue it sometimes it is the other way around because of the power of advertising, right? But I found this as sort of too simplistic. And I've thought I worked in engineering for 20 years, and they're nearly all good people. I mean, there's some crooks like there are in the church and in politics and in charities, in every sector, right? But mostly they were good people just wanting to make good stuff, employ good people. And so I became really interested in how we could use the power of business to solve big global problems, and particularly climate change, because it was one that was very real, and I had a personal interest in it. So for the last 13 years, I've been working on that. So I with CDP, who some of you will know, the Carbon Disclosure Project, I joined that in early days and helped grow that, and then bring me business. And I remain firmly of the belief that it's for society to decide what it wants business and markets to deliver, and then business will deliver them. It just needs some tweaking of the rules of the game. Yeah, so that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing now.
Fascinating story. I love the glacier story. It's a real vivid picture. Do you know what's happening up there now? Presumably that situation has worsened considerably since then.
Yeah, funnily enough, 3 of my best friends are professors of glaciology. So Pete Nino is professor in Edinburgh, Martin Seeger in Imperial College, and Alan Hubbard, who's at Aberystwyth and in Tromsø in Norway. And I went back about 2014. I sailed with Alan from West Greenland to Iceland. It's speeding up, right? And we don't really understand because we've never been there before, right? But it's all speeding up, and it's not good news. So yeah.
It would be, I suppose, it'd be remiss of us not to speak about energy sector transformation, which is something that you mentioned earlier on, and it's something that I know is it's at the forefront of our minds at Scottish Renewables, but also is of vital importance to our members, and we've really seen that accelerate, especially in Scotland. And in Scotland, we've done things before much of the rest of the world, and I think that, for me, it's one of the reasons I'm in Scotland, because we're taking that kind of that faster road. And we can show the rest of the world how to come with us. But reflecting on Amazon's pledge at the moment and their kind of commitment to the whole value chain, and we're often speaking with oil and gas and with government about oil and gas and how their journey will look and how their energy transition will look, and they at the moment aren't considering their kind of downstream products. So the things that they take out of the ground are sold on, and the emissions from them are not counted, and that the decarbonisation journey for oil and gas is primarily about how you get things out of the ground in a net zero way. So do you think that what can we do to shift that dial more quickly, and who needs to take ownership of those downstream emissions? Is it the consumers, or is it the people who produce, the manufacturing businesses as it was? Who needs to do that, and how can we accelerate that energy transition, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I mean, those emissions are kind of a responsibility of everybody who touches them. So I mean, they're absolutely responsibility of oil and gas companies. So that's, I mean, it's just a silly trope to think that you can talk about net zero oil or net zero gas. It's like the kind of nonsense about clean coal, right? But I think there's movements in the right direction. If you look at the details available so far of what BP and Shell have been saying, they are considering the full value chain. I think there's a way to go before we can celebrate a robust net zero oil and gas commitment, but I think there's movement in the right direction. The other thing, of course, is to really concentrate on the demand side. So, I mean, I don't know if any of you saw Shell just last week put out a statement saying that they're formally calling for the phase out of combustion engines in the UK in 2030. I think that I think that the leading oil and gas companies are going to have to be much more clear about their advocacy for demand side change. Otherwise, they can just hide behind the fact that change is slow in coming. And investors are increasingly getting frustrated with particularly oil and gas companies, but that'll extend to automotive and other heavy emitters like cement and steel, who sort of say one good thing about climate, but then lobby another good thing. So you might also have seen last year's result of an initiative called Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a very large group of investors working on the biggest, on the sort of roughly 150 companies responsible for the majority of emissions in their value chain. So that includes all of the oil and gas majors, really pushing for alignment between company public affairs positions and those positions of their trade bodies. So you start to see Shell put some of their trade bodies on notice. I think that's the beginning of a trend. Investors are getting frustrated with companies saying one thing, but actually lobbying either directly or indirectly for something else. So I think, the demand side is really key. So that, and then I think telling the story of the transition. So, there's very little demand today for zero carbon trucks because there's very few on the road. But if you look at, when you look at trucking, it's basically going to be a mixture of batteries and hydrogen. It depends on how heavy and how long the trucks have got to run for. So, the writing's on the wall for last mile delivery trucks. Like cities will not allow combustion engines to deliver trucks by 2030. Amazon, UPS, many at DHL, many of the big fleet owners have already committed to join the climate groups EV100. And now starting to see the evidence that at the heavy duty end, so Daimler trucks have committed to net zero 2039, at least in their biggest markets of North America, Europe, and Japan. So that kind of means, as a policymaker, that's the biggest truck manufacturer in the world. As a policymaker, you could say we're going to go net zero trucks in our market with zero risk, because the bigger, and they've just joined forces with Volvo, another one of the major manufacturers, and a fuel cell initiative, and then they're just joining forces with Rolls-Royce, trying to drive fuel cell generators to replace diesel generators in data centers. So I think it's really important to tell the stories of how fast mainstream players are now driving technology adoption, because that's the sort of signal of the route of the way things are going to go. And when those guys get on the front foot, things are going to go very fast.
I guess that's the story as well of trying to of our job at SR, trying to motivate people to shout about the good stuff that they're doing. If it gives confidence to their whole value chain, and we've seen a story from a wind turbine blade company this morning about circular economy and recyclability, and if developers see that happening, it gives them confidence that they can take part in that too, and that others can follow.
Yeah, and so much of this sort of transition is about confidence and belief, right? And that's the sort of that's. I mean, I'm sure all of you in one way are entrepreneurs. You may literally be the person who founded the company, but you're also sort of systems entrepreneurs, and we're all working in that game of building confidence, because it's about, when policymakers and investors have confidence, then things change. When they're nervous, they don't change. And I mean, I think that particularly with the delay of COP, actually, we have an amazing opportunity to really get organized to tell that story of the inevitable transformation. I mean, we will have a zero carbon economy. There's no doubt about that, right? I mean, the science is so overwhelming of just how bad it is to get it wrong. And it keeps getting worse. You know, and the IPCC will publish some of their next generation reports next year, which again will say that their understanding of risk has gone up, which will bring, you know, tens more millions of young people onto the streets saying, when are you going to take this seriously and fix it? So it's inevitable that we're going to get there. It's only a question of how fast, and the faster the better, and the more organized the better, because if it's not organized, the way that complex systems change is they flip. And a discontinuous change will mean all sorts of economic and human damage, which is why it's so important that policymakers put clear end dates so that we can together build pathways for transition. So, you know, so that the Scottish oil industry can, and the people working in there and the families who depend on those incomes can transition into being the Scottish clean energy industry, not just be shut down overnight because we have a change of policy in a panic situation.
I'm going to ask, just before I see we've got questions coming in on the chat now, so I'll go to Cara in a second, but I wanted to ask what might be a facetious question first, I suppose. If the race to zero is a race, who's winning at the moment?
Well, I mean, there's two answers to that. One is that that we're all losing because not enough of us are in it, and it's a race that we win or lose together. The other argument is that you know, the UK and the EU are winning and America is losing because they've got a government who's slowing them down. That China is winning and Japan is losing because China's pushing clean tech and Japan is holding back. So you can make the argument both at a sort of micro, sort of country to country, or a company to company. But I mean, overall, Gonzalo and I have this fancy title of high-level champion. We need 7.5 billion champions because, you know, this is not a race that you want to lose, because we will lose it together or win it together.
Good answer, Nigel. Thank you. Right, Cara, I'm conscious we've got people asking questions on the chat, so I will flip to you, and perhaps if you could avail us of some of those, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, so thanks to everyone that's already submitted questions. I might just jump into some of our pre-submitted ones first, which kind of goes off the back of what you were talking about, Nick, about our members sort of shouting about those positive stories that they've got to tell. But what other opportunities will there be for companies to showcase their technology or their products in the race to net zero ahead of COP26?
First of all, please call it the race to zero.
Sorry, race to zero.
It's just much simpler. As soon as you word net, it invites all sorts of complex technical questions, so you lose audiences. And basically, we need to get to zero. I mean, the net is a nuance, so we need to eliminate everything. I mean, there will be lots of opportunities, particularly in Scotland. You know, we can connect you to the details are starting to firm up from the UK government team about the way COP is going to be organised. You know, COPs for a long time have had what they call a blue zone, which is more where the negotiations happen and where there are lots of other events. And so Gonzalo and I are responsible for curating an area called the Climate Action Hub within that, where we'll have lots of events. But there's also a green zone, which is open to the public and much more of a sort of celebration of the technology of transformation, which is more accessible for businesses as well. So I think the best thing there is to maybe perhaps via Nick connect you to the UK COP team and as those details firm up, make sure that you use Scottish Renewables as a conduit to make sure you've all got the latest information.
Great, thank you. If we move on to some of the questions that came through from the chat. So you mentioned that there's 3 countries that still haven't made net zero commitments. I think that was the US, China and India. Are there any specific barriers that we need to overcome in order to help them move forward?
Well, first thing I said, they are all moving forward, right? So I wouldn't, you know, and even though the current administration in the States is withdrawing from Paris, you know, it's a federal system, so the states have a lot of power, and California itself is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and absolutely not withdrawing. In fact, they're accelerating. Candidate Biden has just shared a very ambitious energy package. So I'd say in the states, you know, a president who promised to bring back coal has presided over faster closure of coal power generation than his predecessor. So markets are basically decided there. I think that, I mean, there are specific barriers in the states, like the EPA is currently rolling back fuel efficiency standards for cars, which I think is basically just bad news for the American automotive industry, and good news for European and Asian auto manufacturers, because America is not big enough to dictate world standards now, whereas Europe and China between them is like 70% of the world market. China and India are very different. I mean, the politics of climate change has been very much that the developed Western economies caused the problem, and developing countries are suffering from it. So there's that asymmetry has been at the heart of the political impasse in climate change for a long time, because China and India are far from undeveloped countries. They're very complex, very big economies that are both very developed and developing at the same time. Both China and India, I mean, India's, you know, a massive renewable success story. You know, in Paris they said they'd go for 175 gigawatts. Now they're going for 450. So I think it's more sort of political, geopolitical, if you like, rather than practical. I mean, both China and India are continuing to go ahead very fast. Of course, we don't know exactly what their COVID recovery packages will look like. There's some worrying noise about coal in both economies. My understanding is that in India, that's words rather unlikely to be followed by deeds, because of the economics already of renewables versus coal in India. China may be a bit more complex, where a lot of decisions are made at the local, provincial level, and you know, keeping open or reopening or building coal infrastructure might look like an attractive short-term measure to ensure or build employment, although the economics sort of medium-term are silly for doing that. So I think that the barriers are very different, but they tend to be more geopolitical than economic.
Nigel, how do you think I guess to step back a bit, we're very lucky in Scotland that we've had political acceptance of and political support for very broadly renewable energy since the Scottish Parliament was set up more than 20 years ago. How important do you think that political acceptance of renewable energy is in terms of the race to zero? It might seem like a no-brainer to back renewable energy, but you mentioned, you know, Australia doesn't, US really, you know, has mixed views. How important is it that national governments get on renewable energy, onto the bandwagon?
Well, I mean, the quick answer is it's really important, but as I said, pointed earlier, actually on renewables, you know, the economics are sort of increasingly trumping policy. Yeah. Right, so that's what, you know, if it was just politics, then people would be building coal-fired power stations in the States, but they're not. They're shutting them. Mm. Right. I mean, my favourite example is, I think it's the CEO of Appalachian Power, and I think it was a conversation with the governor of Kentucky, who asked him to build another coal-fired power station, and he basically just laughed at him. They said, but no one will buy the electricity because Google, Microsoft, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, General Mills, Kellogg's, you know, BMW, Ford, they're all committed to only buying renewable energy. So why, you know, be stupid to buy something to build something that's no one's going to buy. And that also so on renewables, I'd say decreasingly important, although still very important in some countries, like in Japan, for example, which are still planning to, you know, it's the only major industrial country still planning to build new coal and continuing, although they're closing the loopholes to fund overseas coal. So the politics of at the top really matters, but decreasingly so in a smaller number of countries. For renewables, for the rest of the energy transition, absolutely, because we're at a much earlier stage, right? So I mean, really, we need every country to have a clear date for phasing out combustion engines. as early as possible, because that will just accelerate the transition. And if everybody moves, then it de-risks it for everybody. And then on some of the areas like heavy industry, where we really need big investments in new process technology, like new ways of creating primary steel through direct electrolysis or hydrogen reduction, that's tens of billions of dollars of investment. So that's where governments need to invest alongside business in the early stage, or create the market pull by, for example, on hydrogen, by saying that by mandating low levels of blend of hydrogen to the thermal grid, which can generate demand, which can stimulate investment, knowing that there's demand there in the future. So I think for renewables, less and less, but for the energy transition, the climate transition more broadly, crucial.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cara, back to you for some questions from the chat, please.
Yeah, we've got lots of questions coming through. Please keep sending them on. Sort of picking up on that energy transition, what do you see as the biggest barrier that still needs to be hurdled in Scotland to ensure that we get that zero target?
I don't know. I'm not an expert in your politics, but my guess would be that there isn't yet a strong enough story of transition for the North Sea, and that we can't make a villain of oil and gas in the North Sea, because it's been a boon to the Scottish economy, and those are good people doing hard work to wrest energy from difficult conditions, for the benefit of society. So, but that has to stop, right? So there has to be a powerful, positive narrative of a transition for the North Sea. And I'm sure you're very involved in that. I'd be really hopeful that could be around, offshore and increasingly floating wind, and a lot of the engineering supply chain infrastructure being repurposed, because obviously there's, that's. I would say to people, if you think that big floating wind deployment is part of the transition, then you'd want people involved who've got big balance sheets, knowledge of complex engineering projects, an appetite for risk, and an ability to work in a dangerous offshore environment. And so that means the whole oil and gas supply chain, right? So you want from Equinor, down the supply chain, you want people who know how to do those kind of things and repurpose them. But I think that's probably the biggest obstacle, is it still feels to me like it's a conflict rather than a collaboration for a smooth transition.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. There's a number of comments actually in the chat, and one I was going to ask too about finance and the importance of finance in the race to zero. Effectively, Andrew Smith from Greenbackers is talking about the analysts that you mentioned earlier, so Bloomberg and others, and that their analysis is inhibiting investment, and what can we do about that? Is it for us to somehow call them out and try and push them faster and further? But in general, we know that finance is one of the key things that our members struggle with. It's one of the key challenges, one of the biggest dependencies of building a renewable energy project, and the finance community is obviously pretty key to tackling climate change. What's been done to get them on board, and are they coming?
Well, I think they are. There's sort of two questions there, one about the analysts, one about finance, and of course they're related, because and this is why I would call out the IEA and Bloomberg for always getting it wrong on the low side in terms of how fast things can and do change, because policymakers and finance analysts look to them for guidance and see that as gospel, and then hide behind that without doing their own work. So I think one thing you can do is keep pointing out just how fast costs have come down, just how fast deployment has gone up, and keep extrapolating that. Call people out who are. I think there's a real problem in the way that some of these analysts think about things. They try and project forward, bottom up. They don't think about systems dynamics and the way that we actually know systems change. There's a lovely report which BEIS did, actually. I've got it on my desk, called, and we can send you a link, called "Accelerating the Low Carbon Transition," which uses some of that empirical evidence of the way. Tell that story about just how fast things do change once they take off. And some of you will have been in this game for 20 years, so it might feel like you've always been promising things are going to change fast. All right, but that's the nature of systems changes. Nothing happens forever, and then suddenly everything happens overnight. Everyone goes, shit, how did that happen? Didn't see that coming. You see that in the EV market now. All the big manufacturers are saying, oh my God, I wish we'd started 10 years earlier, as they get their market share eaten by Tesla. right? And they're all realizing that you can't pivot on a dime. It's very difficult to chase an exponential. So tell that story a lot. In terms of finance, I think it is changing. I mean, you're seeing the rating agencies now starting to factor in climate strategy into their ratings. That'll take a while. We've got this growing number of asset owners who are the ultimate owners of capital, mainly pension funds and insurance funds, committing to net zero. So that basically means that ultimately all the companies that they hold will have to commit to net zero. So that's a big signal. That's nearly $5 trillion of assets. And we know of initiatives that haven't yet launched, but which are likely to launch in the coming months, certainly before COP, of asset managers, either people who run the money for the pension funds, and banks who provide the direct finance, project finance. So I think that's another part of the transition. I think the finance sector's been slow, like a lot of service sector who service the whole economy. So many of you are niche, right? So you go straight for, you bet the farm basically on the transition, right? So you're the sort of Elon Musk's of Scotland, right? So all you do is you go for that. But if you're a bank or a strategy consultancy, you're deriving 99% of your revenue from, let's say, old industry. It's very hard to pivot quickly, but that's starting to happen. I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of those businesses are realizing that, if you like, the next big opportunity for them is financing or advising the clean revolution, like they've all made a lot of money from financing or advising the digital revolution. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nigel. 3 minutes to go. One more question, I think, Cara, if we could.
Yes. So, as our last question, do you think we're doing enough on improving energy efficiency?
That's something we think about. We always say do that first before you do anything else. So,
yeah, I mean, generally speaking, no. I mean, there's lots of good work being done around the world. Actually, India is one of the best case studies for energy efficiency. There's also a really good. This would be a really good thing to focus on in terms of clean recovery, right? Because, but generally speaking, no. We know that we need to improve energy efficiency globally by about 3% per year. And in order to be on track for even well below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So we're not doing enough now. Of course, one of the biggest things we can do in terms of energy efficiency is electrification. Like switching from combustion engines to electric vehicles gives a big energy efficiency boost, because combustion engines are much more efficient electric motors are much more efficient than combustion engines. And there's a lot we can do in the built environment in particular. But generally speaking, no, we need to do a lot more of that. And a lot of that's around standards, right? Although India is an interesting case study of where government spending has been used to drive costs down. It's a very big economy and they've done some really good things. I think India is probably one of the leading examples there. But generally speaking, we need to do a lot more.
Great, thank you, Nigel. That's been fascinating, and yeah, I'm sure we all sending you applause right now for that. That's been really, really good. Thanks for a really deep dive into some of those global issues. If you want to keep up to date with our COP events, you can sign up for our events mailing list. We'll tell you how in the follow-up email. There's just a link to a Google form, but if you want to just drop me an email, you can do that too, and I'll make sure you're on there. That follow-up email will also contain a feedback survey on the webinar today, so please do fill that in. It helps us make sure that we're providing the best event series that we can for delegates and members like yourselves. So thanks to Nigel for taking part, much appreciated. Great to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you to the audience for asking questions, and finally, thanks to the COP26 team at UK Government for bringing this all together. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your days.
And Nick, I'd like to thank you to all of you for all your leadership in driving the transition, and good luck, and hope to see you in Scotland. If not before, then in Glasgow next November. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.